Good morning. 4th of July weekend and a guest preacher, and you're here. I'm pleased. Thank you. Had a good experience this morning with the early worship and in Sunday school, so thanks for inviting me. I have to apologize a little bit. My voice is just a little bit foggy this morning. I was out last night, and we had friends celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. And a part of their celebration meant that we had to go outside and be around a bonfire and watch fireworks. So out in the damp last night. It seems to me that offering a compassionate voice of reason is a bit difficult these days, let alone being heard as one who's speaking with compassion. Sometimes even to speak as a Christian requires considerable explanation and context. I often find myself having to clarify why I do things and say things as a Christian, which includes explaining my unusual behaviors, like demonstrating mercy, forgiveness, inclusiveness, or why I am not supportive of violence and revenge or ostracism. More often than not, I am explaining that I'm not like those others who self-identify as Christians or are interviewed by the media as typical American Christians. And I find myself saying, well, I'm not them. I'm not that. I'm just a follower of Jesus. Well, I think it's fair to say that these are troubled times for our country, for its cultures. Now, I don't know if you experience the times as I do or feel or think as I do, but to me, it seems there are more exaggerated patterns of exclusion. There's more self-centeredness, more disdain for truth, more violent behavior in everyday life, more separation among peoples by class and by beliefs, more authoritarian positions taken, more making of enemies. And it's becoming more difficult to distinguish, so what's business, so what's religion, and so what's governance? It might just be me, but the daily news seems to be filled with such things. But on the contrary, I have to tell you about Friday morning. I was in Kansas City for a few days at a conference, and I had to mail a package, and so I got up Friday morning on my way to the meeting to find a post office, and the nearest one was in Westport, in the Kansas City area. And I arrived about 8 o'clock and discovered the post office wasn't open until 8:30. So here I was assessing what should I do, and I decided to stay put and wait for the office to open. As I approached the post office, there were a couple of African-American older men sitting on the sidewalk. I sort of identified them as street people, and one of them reached up and punched the button to automatically open the door for me. I stepped inside. Here was a young man with dark sunglasses on, earbuds in, and he greeted me, and we got into a conversation. And the next thing you know, we were talking about books we've read lately. And he said to me, well, you seem like a cultured person. What do you recommend that I read? And here we were talking. And at that point, an ancient Asian woman with a cane was trying to negotiate the steps rather than going around to the access part of the post office entryway. And I stepped over to assist her, but that young dude in his glasses and his earbuds beat me to her and assisted her up the steps. Then a young man came in, working class, with a couple of big envelopes, and there wasn't an automatic stamp machine there, so we all had a debate as to how much we thought that would require for the postage on those two things. And then another fellow came in, looked like a business person, had a tie, and seemed to be much in a hurry. And the next thing you know, we were having this conversation with us when the doors opened and two young African-American women were running the post office. And we came in, got in line. And for the next few minutes, I heard more, please, thank you, oh no, get ahead of me, may I help you, and apologies going around. In just a couple of minutes, I thought I was in another world. I just came out of this world of trouble, and here was a community compassionately caring for each other on the cuff. Because it seems that we these days are more prone to identify stereotypes of others by our narrow perceptions of their thoughts or values or political affiliations. It seems quicker to say that something's a lie. We are more defensive of our rights and our property. And again, all you have to do is check in with the latest debate in Washington, D.C., or pay attention to the daily hate-motivated shootings. So I keep asking, what do people need? What's behind this behavior and these demands? Maybe people need more security. Maybe they want to find more trust, are desperate for something to hold on, need more assurance that the future will be better. Well, I admit to you, I do not have specific answers to those questions. But I can tell you I have a response to these troubled times. And I'm going to tell you this, I am a conservative fundamentalist. Now, a few of you who know me are going, what? So let me explain. I'm a conservative because I want to preserve human dignity and well-being. I want to conserve the worth of every person, conserve the right of each person to have a voice as a member of Earth's community. And this conservatism of mine is based on some fundamentals. Fundamentally, I believe that the universe is God's creation and is a whole system dependent upon human responsibility for caring for it. I fundamentally believe it is our responsibility as human beings to build community with reason and distributive justice and mercy for all. So you see, I'm a conservative fundamentalist right there. Now, being a follower of Jesus and explaining that to the general public may seem to be somewhat narrowly a contemporary dilemma, but maybe not. In the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 10, of which we earlier shared a portion of that chapter, in that chapter, Jesus is calling his disciples and commissioning them to engage in healing ministry in their neighborhood, particularly the villages and towns of the region of Galilee. Now, I'll offer just a little bit of context for that story in Matthew 10. The Gospels were formally remembered and later written down after the Roman Empire had destroyed Jerusalem, 70 Common Era. And while they were in diaspora, they were recalling what Jesus said and did to guide them in their coming age of separation from Judaism and persecution by the Roman Empire. So they're sitting in this desperate situation, worrying about the future and saying, we better go to the stories of Jesus to get clear on what's happening. They especially remembered Jesus' encounters with the powers and principalities of his generation. Now, during Jesus' time, around the Western Mediterranean, specifically Galilee and Judea, Romans occupied that territory. In fact, they're the ones that gave the name to that territory, Palestine, that's the Anglo version of the Latin version of land of the Philistines, Palestine. And the Romans exacted a very oppressive and political and economic system. They wanted a tremendous toll of production and obedience. with their puppet kings, first Herod the Great, and then his sons, namely the one son Herod Antipas, the people of Galilee were forced in labor to exact wheat and dried fish to the extent they were depleting the resources to feed the cities and to feed Rome itself. They had to pay over 50% of all goods and income in taxes. So don't be whining about taxes in our country. All to support the Roman military empire and the rapid urbanization of the Herod family. Land was confiscated, indebtedness was an all-time high, rural poverty increased, health declined, and religious loyalty to the Roman culture was demanded. Now, some of you may know, and those of you that have been in my Osher class, know that the Galileans were resistors. In fact, they resisted imperial regimes all the way back to the kingdoms of David and Solomon, known for numerous rebellions and insurrectionist leaders at the time of Jesus. As rural and small-town people, they were pushed further and further to the margins. Serious questions arose about the complicity with Rome of the temple and its leaders down in Jerusalem. Judea and Jerusalem was put under direct governorship to keep the lid on resistance there. Roman governors appointed the high priests at that time. Now, in the midst of this oppressive situation, here's Jesus making his way from town to town as an itinerant preacher and healer, ultimately on his way to the seat of power in Jerusalem. And in this context, he called and commissioned his disciples to engage in ministry with him. In Matthew 10, in that chapter, is the memory that he instructed them on what to say, what to carry, and how to handle harassment. He said, quote, "You're going to be like sheep among wolves. So be wise as serpents and gentle as doves." And he further said, don't worry about anything. The Spirit will supply your needs. And he advised them, quote, "Don't be afraid of those who kill the body and can't kill the soul." And he also cautioned them, and this is a part of that passage we read earlier this morning. He cautioned them that this ministry is going to be upsetting to many. It's going to be in your households, and you're going to have fathers against sons and mothers and, that complexity. It's going to be disturbing. Be prepared for that. I don't think he was arguing, I'm coming to bring war, but he says the consequences of my ministry are going to divide the camps. Households against their own members, or in other words, it's going to be a crucible out there. And then he said, here's Matthew 10, verses 40 through 42, a slightly different version than what you have before you. "Those who receive you are also receiving me, and those who receive me are receiving the one who sent me. Those who receive a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. Those who receive a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. I assure you that everybody who gives even a cup of cold water to these little ones, because they are my disciples, will certainly be rewarded." Well, I'm hooked by that phrase. Will receive a prophet's reward, or a righteous person's reward. What kind of reward is this going to be? Well, let's remember a bit of the Hebrew First Testament heritage in which Jesus stood. The prophets. Now, the prophets were sometimes represented as elders or leaders or matriarchs and patriarchs in Israel tradition. But the classic traditional prophetic figures went from, say, Samuel and Elijah down through Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Micah, Ezekiel, all the way down to John the Baptizer and Jesus. and they had several distinctive characteristics. Now, they were called in the Hebrew language Nabi, which translated into American means crazy people. Well, crazy people who spoke for God. Although they may have come out of priestly traditions or political positions, or traveled in a band of seers and soothsayers, or were called as lay people, they were all called. That is, they all experienced and accepted an assignment from God to speak and act on behalf of God, to demonstrate God's intentions in the world by their words and their deeds. And for the most part, those prophets were sharp critics of political and religious institutions of their day, of the evolution of those entities. The prophets were always confronting the king, or the ruling priests, or the wealthy establishment, the oligarchy of governance, religious authority, and resource ownership of their time. And the prophets exposed the evils of arrogance and self-righteousness and injustice. And so therefore they were frequently a voice of judgment. Those of you that have read Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos, their words of woe, you know the harsh judgment that's there. However, the prophets were also for something. Well, they were again, but they were also for. And they were for returning to the values of what they perceived as the good old days of the covenant, when it was just God and the people. When perhaps, although idealized and romanticized, back when it was just us and God in the wilderness, a community of faith in God alone, when we were a people of the love of God, of neighbor and self as a unified whole. So therefore the prophets were critical of anything that broke that relationship. Now, so also the prophets pointed to the future, when the covenant, the community of faith of old, would be restored, when shalom would come. So they would wind up being both announcers of the day of the Lord, of judgment, and the day of the Lord of peace. Now, if we were to envision the historic, faithful, prophetic role today, what would it look like? Maybe crazy people who keep speaking and acting for inclusive community, who keep thinking, explaining, and reasoning together. Crazy people who keep receiving and accepting the gifts of many cultures, who keep working for a unity of people not based on authority and superiority, but rather on authenticity and dignity and well-being, participatory, nonviolent cooperation. I told you about that little glimpse at Westport. But lest I stray from the question I posed earlier, what is that reward for faithful people? Now, for many of the classic prophets of history, the consequences were confrontation, accusation of treason, rejection, banishment, imprisonment, and even death. Granted that the prophet's words and deeds have been recorded and remembered and recited, and we say were fulfilled in the words and deeds of Jesus and in the Christian community. But the immediate rewards that came to prophets? Yes, some people did heed the prophet's lessons and turn back to God, but sadly, the momentum of greed and power and entitlement carried too many people right back into systemic and personal injustice. So maybe, just maybe, the prophet's reward is found in those moments when we glimpse a simple act of mercy and kindness. as Matthew said, a cup of water offered, a person who gives something unselfishly. And just the other day, I heard the retelling of the story of the forgiveness that the Christians of Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston offered to the shooter, Dylan Roof. It sometimes takes careful observation, careful listening, but we can glean from the stories of the news of our day the stories of people who make positive differences. Just a week ago, I heard a former Marine combat veteran tell of his return to Vietnam and how he found welcome, gracious welcome from his former enemies, and found forgiveness and reconciliation. And I'm reminded of a couple I know here in our community who have dedicated their lives to growing organic produce, primarily to share freely with those who have need, good, healthy food to eat. Now, some of you may have read recently or heard the recent news stories of the new position that's now at the Smithsonian Institution. Have you heard that story? Now, I was particularly paying attention because I just have a niece who just went to D.C. to be on the Smithsonian staff. And so so I paid attention. Peter Manseau was recently named the Lilly Endowment Curator of American Religious History at the Smithsonian. And you may be aware that a Religion in Early America exhibition opened there at the Smithsonian this past June 28. Well, I heard the National Public Radio story about 5 pieces that are in that exhibit that symbolize America's historic openness and welcome to religious diversity. In the museum, these 5 pieces that they represented, a 1640 Puritan Bay psalm book representing the Puritan quest for religious freedom. It has also George Whitfield's portable pulpit. Some of you may recall George Whitfield was that itinerant social justice preacher that most congregations would not allow in their buildings. But masses of folks would hear him out in the fields. It contains Thomas Jefferson's paste up of the New Testament gospel. You know, he cut and pasted the pieces that he wanted and put it all together in what he called the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth. In that exhibit, it also has a journal record of Islamic tenets by an enslaved Muslim by the name of Bilal Muhammad, who was trying to preserve, even while enslaved, a record of his heritage of faith. And in that exhibit also are the saddlebags of a former slave owner by the name of Freeborn Garretson. One Sunday morning, Garretson, while reading the Bible, was stopped cold, and he said, "I heard the voice of God." And he said the voice of God commanded him to let go of his slaves. And Garretson then became an abolitionist minister, traveling from plantation to plantation, trying to convince other slave owners that they were violating Christian teaching. Now, each of these items and people represent many who are seeking sanctuary. Members of some religious minority back home facing persecutions for their beliefs, Puritans, Baptists, Quakers, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, all seeking America as a place where they'd be free to practice their faith. And therefore, they became contributors to our heritage of diversity and the significance of faith. Well, as we are in the midst of the 4th of July holiday, it is a good time to remember those prophetic voices from our cultural and political past. They, I think, characterize another reward of being a prophet. And that's the reward of seeing the long-term, big picture and trusting this sacred vision as an alternative to much of what contemporary society is saying about the future. Our commission, be like Jesus. Live into the coming realm of God. Trust that we live in times where we can make positive decisions for the earth and its inhabitants. We can live full lives of integrity, mercy, and peace. And that in itself is a reward. I was just at the National Storytelling Network annual conference in Kansas City. That's my reference to the Westport post office. And I was in a workshop led by a woman named Noah Baum. And she was an Israeli citizen. That's her origin. And she now works to bring Israeli Jews and Muslims into community. She's working with Israeli citizens and Palestinians, whether those Palestinians be Arab or Christian Palestinians. Well, I was in her workshop, and what she had us do, she assigned us all a little card on which was a welcome in some other language and a description of how you would do that welcome. And we each were given that. There was a group of about 40 of us. And we had then, with a little practice, had to then go to everybody else in the room and deliver that welcome in that language and do the gestures necessary to exchange welcome. And don't do anything else. Don't talk about it. Don't apologize. Just do it. And then we'll talk about it later. And some of those gestures, to me, were bizarre and strange and uncomfortable. What do you do with someone who's kneeling at your feet and kissing your feet? Or what do you do to a person who's just slapped a slobbery kiss on both cheeks and rubbed your nose? What do you do to a people who in their welcome will not make eye contact? That was hard for me. Well, as we all experienced this diversity of welcomes and then processed it, what we found was that we had been in one of the most intimate and cooperative moments of living to learn together, and how rewarding it was. So, bottom line this morning, support your local prophet. Better yet, be one yourself. Amen.